"Can you marry my daughter?" asked the Apache chief. The lonely rancher shocked them all. Thomas had lived on the edge of the New Mexico desert for nearly 2 decades. His ranch was small but sturdy, surrounded by rolling hills, dry grasslands, and the distant outline of mountains that shimmered in the hot sun. Life out here was quiet, almost painfully so. The town was far away, and most days Thomas only saw the horses grazing, the occasional coyote slipping through the brush, or the golden light of sunrise spilling across his land. He liked the peace, but he also felt a deep, gnawing loneliness that no amount of cattle or chores could fill. Thomas had never married. He had loved once, many years ago, but that love had ended with a heartbreak that still left him wary of trusting another person completely. He had poured himself into the ranch, building fences, repairing the small wooden house he called home, and tending to his animals. Yet, no matter how busy he stayed, there were nights when the silence pressed against him like a heavy blanket. The wind would whistle through the open windows, and he would stare at the empty chair at his kitchen table, wondering if life had more in store for him than this solitude. One early morning, as the sun rose in fiery streaks across the horizon, Thomas heard a strange sound in the distance. It wasn't the soft clatter of his cattle or the wings of birds. It was the rhythmic clopping of hooves, but not the kind he was used to. He stepped outside, squinting against the bright light, and saw a group of men riding toward his ranch. Their clothing was different from the cowboys in the nearby town, and their horses were smaller and faster, moving with a grace he had rarely seen. On the lead horse rode a man who carried himself with an unusual dignity. His eyes were sharp and watchful, and his expression was calm yet commanding. Thomas felt a jolt of curiosity and apprehension. Visitors were rare, and travelers rarely came out this far. But these were not ordinary travelers. As they approached, he noticed their faces and the patterns of their clothing. It was clear they were from a different culture, one he had only seen glimpses of from the town markets or during trade fairs. These were Apache people, known for their courage and connection to the land. Thomas had heard stories from old settlers and merchants, tales that mixed admiration with fear, but he had never met an Apache in person. The leader, who Thomas would later learn was a chief, dismounted smoothly. He moved with a quiet strength, and there was an air of authority about him that immediately demanded respect. Thomas, used to handling unexpected situations on the ranch, felt an unusual sense of nervousness. He wiped his hands on his pants, tried to look calm, and stepped forward to greet them. "Good morning," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. "What brings you this far from the town?" The chief spoke slowly, in English that carried the cadence of his own language. "We come in peace," he said, "and we bring a request." Thomas raised an eyebrow. A request? From an Apache chief? This was not something he had anticipated. Usually, requests from visitors were for water, supplies, or perhaps a trade. But there was something different in the chief's eyes, a seriousness, a weight that suggested this was not a simple matter. The chief dismounted completely and gestured for Thomas to sit with him under the shade of a nearby tree. The morning sun beat down on the dusty land, and Thomas felt the warmth on his back as he lowered himself onto a rough wooden bench. Around them, the other Apache men tended to their horses and watched carefully, their presence calm but alert. The chief took a deep breath. "I have a daughter," he said, and Thomas felt the words hang in the air, heavy with meaning. "She is of age, and she is strong, wise, and courageous. I wish for her to marry a man who will care for her and respect our ways. I have chosen you." Thomas blinked. Thomas blinked. He stared at the chief, feeling his mouth dry. The world seemed to tilt slightly, and for a moment he could hear only his own heartbeat. He had expected visitors, conversation, maybe a favor, but never this. The chief had asked him to marry his daughter, an extraordinary, almost impossible request. He wanted to respond immediately, but the words caught in his throat. This was more than a marriage proposal. It was a bond between two worlds, the world of the settlers and the world of the Apache, a connection that carried not just personal meaning, but cultural significance. Thomas had always thought of himself as a simple man, living a simple life, but this was far beyond anything he had imagined. The chief seemed to sense his hesitation. "I understand your surprise," he said gently. "You have lived a quiet life here, alone, but I have observed you. You are honest, hard-working, and you treat the land with respect. These are the qualities I seek for my daughter's husband." Thomas nodded slowly, trying to process the weight of the words. He thought about his life, his solitude, his routine, the endless days of work that filled his hours but left his heart empty. Could he truly consider such a request? Could he step into a world so different from his own and promise a lifetime to someone he had never met? The other Apache men moved quietly around the ranch, their presence respectful. Thomas noticed the care with which they tended their horses, the way they moved in harmony with the land. There was a sense of order and dignity, a quiet strength that impressed him more than he expected. The chief's eyes met his again, steady and unyielding. There was no pressure, no demand, just a profound expectation that Thomas would understand the gravity of the moment. Thomas realized that this was not just about him. It was about trust, about respect, about the possibility of connection across boundaries that many in his world had feared to cross. It was a test of character, of courage, of heart, and somehow, deep inside, he felt the spark of something he had not felt in years, the possibility of belonging, of being needed, of stepping beyond the lonely routine that had defined his life. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Thomas and the chief continued to speak. They talked about the land, about responsibilities, about family. End of footnote. Thomas asked questions about the chief's daughter, her interests, her life, her dreams. The chief answered with honesty, painting a picture of a young woman who was strong, capable, and wise beyond her years. Thomas listened intently, his mind racing with possibilities, fears, and hopes. By the time the Apache group prepared to leave, Thomas felt a strange mix of emotions: shock, curiosity, fear, and an unspoken hope swirled together inside him. The chief's request had thrown his life into a sudden whirlwind, forcing him to confront questions he had long avoided. Could he take this step? Could he open his heart and home to someone from a world so different from his own? As the horses disappeared down the dusty trail, Thomas stood silently, watching the group fade into the distance. The morning air seemed heavier, charged with the promise of change. He knew that in the coming days he would have to make a choice, one that could alter the course of his life forever. For the first time in many years, Thomas felt the stirring of something beyond routine and solitude. There was fear, yes, but also possibility. And deep inside he sensed that his quiet life on the ranch might never be the same again. After the Apache group had left, Thomas's life seemed quieter than ever, but now there was a new tension in the air. The chief's request had stirred something in him that he could not easily shake. He returned to his chores, feeding the cattle, mending fences, and checking on the small vegetable patch near his house. But his mind wandered constantly. Every sound, the wind rustling through the dry grass, the distant call of a hawk, even the soft clop of a horse in the distance, reminded him of the morning's encounter. Word of the Apache chief's visit spread faster than Thomas could have imagined. Though the chief had left quietly, some townsfolk had seen the group and had already begun speculating. By the next day, whispers had reached his ranch. Travelers returning from the town mentioned the story in hushed tones, adding their own opinions and guesses. Some expressed admiration for Thomas, suggesting he was a man of strong character to be considered worthy by the chief. Others warned him that such a connection could bring trouble, mixing the worlds of settlers and Apache people in ways many feared. Thomas tried to ignore the gossip. He had lived in isolation for so long that he was used to people forming opinions about him without knowing the details of his life. Yet, he could not fully escape the awareness that his choices were no longer private. For the first time, the idea of connection between himself and another person, between two very different communities, felt both thrilling and frightening. He thought often of the chief's words, "You are honest, hard-working, and you treat the land with respect. These are the qualities I seek for my daughter's husband." Thomas knew that these qualities were not unusual among ranchers, yet the chief had singled him out. Why him? Why not someone younger, or someone closer to the town, or even someone who had known the chief's family before? The question lingered, unanswered, but it unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. As Thomas wrestled with his thoughts, the town's reactions became more pronounced. Some neighbors came by to check on him, casually asking how he felt about the chief's proposal. Their voices were polite, but there was clear curiosity in their questions. "You really think about it, don't you?" One neighbor asked, leaning on the gate of his fence. "I never thought anyone around here would get such a chance." "I don't know, Thomas. You've been alone all these years. You've built your life here, and now this. It's not just a marriage. It's a bond between two worlds. Are you ready for that?" Thomas appreciated their concern, but it only reminded him how heavy the choice was. He had spent so long living quietly, without expecting anything extraordinary to touch his life. And suddenly he was at a crossroads he had never imagined. The thought of opening himself to another person, and to an entirely different culture, filled him with both hope and fear. At night, Thomas sat by the fire in his small cabin, staring into the flickering flames. The house seemed emptier than usual, the shadows longer and the silence heavier. He thought about the Apache chief, a man who carried himself with quiet dignity, and his daughter whom Thomas had not yet met. Who was she really? Would she accept a life so different from the one she had known? Could he respect her ways, her family, and her people while staying true to himself? Thomas also thought about the possibilities. Maybe this was a chance for friendship, for understanding, for creating a bridge between the two communities. Maybe this could bring companionship, laughter, and shared work, things he had long forgotten. He imagined working alongside her in the fields, repairing fences together, sharing stories by the fire, and learning from each other. The thought made his chest tighten, not with fear, but with a strange warmth he had not felt in years. The Apache community, too, discussed the proposal. Word had reached the chief's advisors and family members, and there were quiet debates. Some supported the idea, seeing Thomas as a man of character who could honor the family and respect their traditions. Others were cautious, worried that a settler might not fully understand the ways of the tribe. They wondered if trust could truly be extended across the cultural divide. But the chief remained firm. He had seen something in Thomas that went beyond words, a steadiness, a kindness, and a willingness to care for the land and those around him. Days turned into a week, and Thomas received another message from the chief. A small party returned to the ranch with a letter, written in careful English, inviting Thomas to a formal meeting with the chief and his daughter. The letter emphasized that there was no pressure, but that the chief wished for Thomas to meet his daughter before making any decision. Thomas read the words over and over, feeling the weight of responsibility settle even deeper in his chest. The thought of meeting her for the first time filled him with nervous anticipation. He had never been in a situation like this. Never had he been asked to consider marriage to someone he barely knew, someone from a world so different from his own. Yet, he also felt curiosity. Who was this young woman? What did she think of him, of his land, of the quiet life he had built? Thomas realized that part of him was eager to find out. Despite the uncertainty and fear, neighbors continued to visit, some out of concern, others out of fascination. Children peeked over fences, whispering to each other about the rancher who might marry the Apache chief's daughter. Thomas smiled at the attention, though it made him feel oddly exposed. For so long he had been invisible to most of the town, living quietly and unnoticed. Now, everyone seemed to have an opinion about his life, his choices, and his future. Despite the growing attention, Thomas kept himself busy. He worked harder than ever on the ranch, using the physical labor to calm his restless mind. He repaired fences, dug irrigation ditches, and painted the wooden walls of his house. Each task reminded him that life went on, regardless of the uncertainty that hovered on the horizon. Yet, in quiet moments, he found his thoughts drifting back to the chief's request, to the possibility of a new life, to the woman he had yet to meet. Finally, after days of waiting, the day arrived for the formal meeting. Thomas cleaned his home, polished the wooden floors, and prepared a simple meal for his guests. He dressed in his best clothes, well worn but clean, and took a deep breath as he looked out across the dusty trail. In the distance he saw the approach of horses, their riders moving steadily toward his ranch. The heart of the quiet man beat faster, and a mixture of fear, hope, and curiosity filled him. When the group arrived, the chief dismounted with the same calm dignity as before. Beside him was his daughter, a young woman with clear, bright eyes that reflected intelligence and strength. She smiled politely at Thomas, and for a moment, he felt the weight of the moment settle fully on his shoulders. He realized that this meeting was not just about a marriage proposal. It was about understanding, respect, and the possibility of connection across worlds. As they sat beneath the shade of the trees, Thomas felt both nervous and intrigued. Questions filled his mind. Would they get along? Could he learn from her and she from him? How would their lives change? But even amid the fear, there was a flicker of excitement. For the first time in years, Thomas felt the possibility that life could be more than solitude, more than quiet work on the ranch. Something new was beginning, and he could not turn away from it. The conversation began slowly, with the chief speaking first, introducing his daughter and sharing stories of her childhood, her accomplishments, and her hopes for the future. Thomas listened carefully, absorbing every detail, means and motes. As the young woman spoke, Thomas realized that she was not simply the daughter of a chief. She was a person with dreams, intelligence, and courage, someone who could challenge him, teach him, and perhaps even bring joy to his lonely life. By the end of the meeting, Thomas felt a deep respect for both the chief and his daughter. He realized that the choice he faced was not simple, but it was also rare, an opportunity to form a bond that could bridge two worlds, to create a connection built on trust and understanding. And though fear and uncertainty remained, he also felt a growing sense of hope, a quiet promise that life might be richer and more meaningful than he had ever imagined. After the meeting with the Apache chief and his daughter, Thomas returned to his home feeling both restless and thoughtful. The encounter had stirred emotions he had not felt in years, curiosity, hope, and even a quiet excitement. But it had also brought a weight of responsibility. For the first time in decades, he realized that his decisions could affect more than just himself. They could affect another person's life, a family, and perhaps even the future of two very different communities. That night, Thomas sat alone by the fireplace, staring into the dancing flames. He thought about the chief's daughter, her calm, confident demeanor, the way she had listened so carefully to his words, and the subtle strength in her eyes. She had impressed him deeply, not because she was the daughter of a chief, but because she was a person with a mind of her own, someone who seemed to understand the value of respect, honesty, and courage. He realized that he wanted to know her better, not as an obligation, but because he genuinely wanted to understand who she was. The next morning, Thomas woke before sunrise, as was his habit, and walked across the quiet ranch. The air was crisp, and the world seemed to be holding its breath. He watched the sun slowly rise over the distant mountains, casting long shadows across the land. The solitude, which had once been comforting, now felt heavier, filled with questions he could not answer. Could he truly step into a life that would connect him with someone from a different culture? Could he honor their traditions while staying true to his own values? Neighbors noticed a change in him. They saw a man who, while still quiet and reserved, carried a thoughtful expression, as if something important weighed on his mind. Some approached him cautiously, curious about his thoughts on the chief's proposal. "You've been thinking about it a lot, haven't you?" asked one neighbor, leaning on the fence. Thomas nodded slowly, not trusting himself to speak yet. Words felt inadequate to capture the complexity of his feelings. Over the following days, Thomas focused on the ranch, yet his mind continued to drift. He spent hours walking the fields, checking the fences, and tending to his animals, all the while turning over the chief's words in his head. He considered his life, years of solitude, hard work, and quiet routine, and compared it to the possibilities before him. He realized that the choice was not only about companionship, but about growth, about stepping beyond what was familiar and comfortable. In the evenings, Thomas often found himself thinking about the chief's daughter in particular. He wondered what her daily life had been like, how she had grown up, and what her dreams for the future were. He imagined conversations with her, sharing stories, learning about each other's worlds, and perhaps discovering common ground despite the differences in their upbringing. The thought both excited and frightened him. He knew that forging a connection would require patience, understanding, and humility. Meanwhile, the Apache community also reflected on the meeting. The chief had returned to his tribe and shared his impressions of Thomas with family members and advisors. Some were hopeful, seeing a rare opportunity for friendship and collaboration between the tribe and the settlers. Others were cautious, questioning whether Thomas could truly understand and respect their ways. The chief remained firm in his judgment, explaining that trust and character were more important than familiarity or convenience. He had seen something in Thomas, a steadiness and honesty, that gave him confidence in the man's potential. Thomas received a message from the chief inviting him to a second, more personal meeting with his daughter. This time, it would be less formal, an opportunity to speak more freely and begin to build understanding. Thomas read the message carefully, feeling both nervous and eager. He spent the day preparing, cleaning the house, tending to the animals, and making small improvements around the ranch. Each task seemed to calm his nerves, though the anticipation continued to grow. On the day of the meeting, Thomas rose early and walked the land, reflecting on his life and the possibilities ahead. He thought about the quiet years he had spent alone, the routines that had shaped him, and the skills he had developed to survive and thrive in a remote place. But he also thought about the potential for change, the chance to learn, to grow, and to form a connection that might bring joy and purpose beyond what he had known. When the chief and his daughter arrived, Thomas greeted them with a mix of respect and cautious warmth. The young woman smiled politely, and Thomas felt a quiet recognition that this meeting would be different. They would not speak of obligation or duty, but of understanding and compatibility. Over the course of the day, they walked to the ranch together, discussing the land, the animals, and the rhythms of daily life. Thomas showed her how he cared for the horses, tended the crops, and maintained the fences. She observed carefully, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights that surprised him with their depth. As the day progressed, conversation moved beyond practical matters. They spoke about dreams, hopes, and fears. Thomas found himself sharing stories from his past, childhood memories, lessons learned on the ranch, and moments of joy and hardship. The young woman listened intently, occasionally asking questions that prompted him to reflect more deeply. He realized that he was not simply explaining his life to her. He was discovering new aspects of himself through the act of sharing. The young woman, too, shared her experiences. She spoke of her childhood in the tribe, her love for the land, and her desire to contribute meaningfully to her community. Thomas listened with respect, recognizing the strength and wisdom in her words. He began to see that this connection was not about changing each other, but about learning from one another and finding ways to honor both of their worlds. By the time the sun began to set, Thomas felt a quiet sense of hope. The initial shock and fear had given way to curiosity and understanding. He realized that forming a bond with the chief's daughter would require courage, patience, and empathy, but it could also bring companionship, learning, and growth. The thought that he might no longer be alone in the world, that he could share his life with someone who respected and understood him, filled him with a warmth he had not felt in years. That evening, as the chief and his daughter prepared to leave, Thomas felt a mixture of anticipation and resolve. He knew that he would need time to consider his decision fully, but he also recognized the importance of openness, honesty, and respect. He thanked them for their visit, expressing his appreciation for the opportunity to meet and learn about the young woman. The chief nodded, acknowledging the thoughtfulness in Thomas's response, and his daughter smiled warmly, a gesture that lingered in Thomas's mind long after they had gone. In the days that followed, Thomas continued his routine on the ranch, but his perspective had shifted. He was more reflective, more aware of the possibilities that life could offer beyond solitude. He thought about the young woman, her wisdom, and her strength, and how their lives might intersect in meaningful ways. Each day he considered not just his own needs and desires, but the needs and hopes of another person, a realization that both humbled and inspired him. Neighbors noticed a change in Thomas as well. He seemed more thoughtful, more engaged, and even a little lighter in spirit. Some asked him if he had made a decision, and while he smiled at the question, he remained thoughtful. He knew that this was a choice that required time, reflection, and courage. It was not a decision to be made lightly, but he also felt a growing sense of readiness to face the challenge. As the week drew to a close, Thomas spent time preparing his thoughts in his home, considering what he could offer and how he could honor both his own life and the traditions of the young woman and her family. He recognized that the path ahead would require effort, understanding, and patience, but he also understood that the potential reward, a meaningful connection, shared respect, and companionship was worth the effort. By the end of the week, Thomas felt a quiet determination. He was no longer the solitary rancher who had lived only for his land and his routines. He had opened his mind and heart to the possibility of a life that included another person, someone who could challenge him, teach him, and share in the work and joys of daily life. The chief's proposal, once shocking and unexpected, had become a catalyst for growth, reflection, and the potential for a future richer than he had ever imagined. The morning Thomas had been waiting for finally arrived. Today the chief and his daughter were returning to the ranch, and Thomas felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. He had spent days preparing, not just the house and the land, but also his thoughts. He wanted to make a good impression, to show that he respected their culture, and to demonstrate that he was sincere about considering the chief's request. He rose before sunrise, as he always did, and walked the fields, checking the fences, the irrigation, and the animals. The quiet of the early morning gave him time to think clearly, to organize his thoughts, and to prepare for the meeting ahead. He wondered what the young woman would be like today, more reserved or more open, cautious or friendly. He had spent time reflecting on their previous encounter, replaying the conversation in his mind, and he realized he was eager to get to know her better. By the time the chief and his daughter arrived, Thomas had cleaned the cabin, set up chairs under the shade of the trees, and prepared a simple breakfast. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of dust and dry grass, and the sun shone brightly over the ranch. The chief dismounted first, nodding respectfully to Thomas. His daughter followed, riding with calm confidence, her expression thoughtful yet friendly. "Good morning, Thomas," the young woman said as she stepped off her horse. Her voice was clear, and there was a quiet strength in it that immediately commanded respect. Thomas felt a little nervous, but he smiled and offered his hand to help her down. She shook it politely, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, sharing a quiet acknowledgement of the unusual situation they were in. After greeting each other, they walked toward the main house and sat under the large oak tree near the edge of the property. Thomas had arranged a small picnic with simple foods: bread, cheese, dried fruits, and fresh water. It was modest, but it reflected his life and his care for the land, and he hoped it would be appreciated. The chief nodded in approval, then sat nearby, giving them space to converse. The conversation began slowly, with small talk about the land, the weather, and the daily tasks of running a ranch. Thomas showed her the stables, explaining how he cared for the horses, fed them, and maintained the corral. She asked questions, genuinely interested, and listened carefully to his answers. Thomas was struck by how attentive and thoughtful she was. She noticed details he had never considered important: the type of grass for the horses, the way water ran through the irrigation channels, and even the patterns of the wind across the land. As they walked through the fields, the conversation grew deeper. Thomas spoke of his life as a rancher, the quiet routine, the long days, and the solitude. He shared stories of challenges he had faced, such as harsh weather, lost cattle, and the hardships of living in a remote place. She listened intently, sometimes asking questions that made him reflect in new ways. Her perspective was different from anyone he had known. She seemed to understand the rhythm of his life and respected his dedication to the land. In turn, she shared stories of her own life. She spoke of her family, her people, and the traditions of the tribe. She described the lessons she had learned growing up, lessons of respect, courage, and community. Thomas was fascinated. He realized that her upbringing had shaped her into a person of wisdom and strength, someone who could navigate life with intelligence and compassion. He admired her more with every story she told. They also discussed hopes for the future. Thomas spoke of his dreams for the ranch, ways to improve it, and his desire for a life that included companionship and shared responsibilities. The young woman spoke of her dreams for her community, her hopes to learn new skills, and her desire to connect with people beyond her immediate world. Thomas realized that despite their different backgrounds, they shared many values: honesty, hard work, respect for the land, and a desire for meaningful connections. As the hours passed, Thomas felt a growing sense of comfort around her. The initial awkwardness and nervousness faded, replaced by genuine curiosity and engagement. They laughed together over small mistakes he had made while tending the land, and she shared stories that made him smile. Thomas noticed that her presence brought a lightness to the day, a warmth he had not felt in many years. The chief observed quietly from a distance, watching their interactions. He noted the respect and thoughtfulness that Thomas showed, the patience in listening, and the genuine care he demonstrated. He also saw the young woman responding in kind, showing curiosity, humor, and intelligence. The chief felt a quiet approval. This was more than a simple meeting. It was the beginning of understanding, the foundation of a connection that could grow into trust and companionship. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, Thomas realized that this meeting was a turning point. It was not simply about deciding whether to accept a proposal. It was about building a relationship based on mutual respect, learning, and shared understanding. He felt the weight of the responsibility, but also a quiet excitement at the possibility of a life that included companionship and shared purpose. They returned to the house as the sun began to lower in the sky. Thomas offered them refreshments, and they sat together, discussing plans for the next visit and ways to learn from each other. The young woman spoke of her interest in helping with the ranch, learning about the animals, and understanding the work required to maintain the land. Thomas welcomed the idea, realizing that teaching her and learning from her would bring new meaning to his daily routine. Before leaving, the young woman turned to Thomas with a gentle but firm expression. "I am glad we have this time together," she said. "I want to understand your life as much as you want to understand mine. If we are to consider the future, we must first respect and learn from each other." Thomas nodded, feeling the truth in her words. He realized that any decision about the future would require thought, patience, and openness. It was not a choice to be rushed, but one to be nurtured carefully. The chief spoke briefly, acknowledging the day's progress. "You have taken time to understand each other," he said. "This is the most important step. Trust and respect are the foundation of any relationship. Continue to learn from one another, and the path will become clear." Thomas felt a deep respect for the chief's wisdom and guidance. He understood that this was not simply a matter of personal desire, but a responsibility to honor both families, traditions, and cultures. After they left, Thomas walked through the fields in quiet reflection. The day had been extraordinary, filled with learning, laughter, and thoughtful conversation. He realized that he had taken a step toward a future that was uncertain but full of potential. The young woman had impressed him not only with her intelligence and strength, but also with her openness and willingness to engage honestly. Thomas felt a growing sense of anticipation, knowing that the next meetings would deepen their understanding and help both of them decide on the path ahead. That evening, Thomas sat by the fireplace, thinking about the conversations of the day. He considered the possibilities, the challenges, the joys, and the learning that lay ahead. He knew that forming a meaningful connection would require effort, patience, and empathy, but he also felt hope and determination. For the first time in years, Thomas imagined a life filled not only with work and solitude, but with companionship, shared responsibilities, and mutual respect. As night fell, Thomas looked out the window at the stars above the ranch. The vast sky seemed to reflect the vast possibilities before him. He understood that the decision he faced was significant, but he also realized that he was no longer alone in facing it. The chief's daughter had opened a door to connection, understanding, and shared purpose. Thomas felt a quiet confidence that, with time, respect, and care, they could navigate the challenges and build a life together that honored both their worlds. For the first time, Thomas went to bed not feeling the weight of isolation, but feeling the promise of a future that might include companionship, understanding, and shared growth. The day had been a turning point, one that brought clarity, hope, and the first real steps toward bridging the gap between two worlds. He knew that the days ahead would require courage and reflection, but he also felt that the foundation had been laid for something remarkable, something that could change his life forever. In the days that followed, Thomas felt a quiet determination settle over him. He had spent long hours thinking about the Apache chief's request, reflecting on the conversations he had shared with the chief's daughter, and considering what a shared future might look like. Each day as he worked on the ranch, he carried with him a sense of purpose that was new and unfamiliar. For so long, his life had been defined by solitude, hard work, and the routine of daily chores. But now there was something else, a possibility that filled his heart with cautious hope. He prepared his home carefully for the next visit, not just cleaning and organizing, but also reflecting on how he could show respect for the young woman and her culture. He thought about what she might appreciate, what might make her feel welcome, and how he could demonstrate that he was serious about understanding and valuing her world. Every decision, from the food he prepared to the way he arranged the chairs beneath the oak tree, was made with thought and intention. When the chief and his daughter arrived that afternoon, Thomas felt a nervous excitement. They had become more familiar with one another in the past meetings, yet this felt different. There was a sense that the moment for a deeper understanding, and perhaps a life-changing decision, had arrived. The chief greeted him with his usual calm dignity, and his daughter smiled warmly, her eyes reflecting intelligence and confidence. Thomas felt both nervous and encouraged, knowing that the time to consider the future had come. They began the day with a walk through the ranch. Thomas showed her the improvements he had made since their last meeting, the repaired fences, the cleared fields, and the better irrigation channels. She listened and observed carefully, asking questions, offering suggestions, and demonstrating a keen interest in the land and the work required to maintain it. Thomas felt admiration for her intelligence and curiosity, realizing that she approached life with the same care, patience, and thoughtfulness that he did. As they walked, conversation turned to the future. Thomas spoke honestly about his fears and hopes, sharing his desire for companionship and the challenges of building a life with someone from a different culture. The young woman listened patiently, responding with thoughtful questions and insights that revealed her understanding and wisdom. She spoke about her own hopes for life, her dreams for contributing to her community, and her interest in learning from and supporting a partner. By mid-afternoon, they returned to the oak tree, where they had often sat, enjoying the shade and the view of the rolling hills. Thomas and the young woman spoke openly, discussing the realities of a shared life, the work required, the cultural differences, and the importance of respect, trust, and understanding. For the first time, Thomas realized that this was not about choosing a partner based solely on affection, but about creating a bond that could withstand the challenges of life, honor both families, and bring joy and support to both people. The conversation was not always easy. There were moments of silence, moments when Thomas struggled to find the right words, and moments when the young woman asked questions that challenged his assumptions and made him reflect deeply. Yet these moments were valuable. They built trust, fostered respect, and allowed both of them to understand each other more fully. By the end of the day, Thomas felt that he had not only learned about her world, but also gained insights into his own character, values, and desires. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the fields, Thomas felt a sense of clarity. He knew that his decision would change his life, but he also understood that the choice was guided by respect, honesty, and mutual understanding. He spoke openly with the young woman, telling her that he wished to accept the chief's proposal, but only with the promise that they would continue to learn from and support each other. She smiled, a warm expression that reflected relief, respect, and hope, and agreed that their shared future should be built on honesty, trust, and cooperation. The chief watched quietly, nodding with approval. He recognized the care, thoughtfulness, and sincerity in Thomas's words and actions. This was more than a simple agreement. It was a demonstration of character, understanding, and commitment. The chief knew that his daughter's future was in capable hands, and he felt a quiet satisfaction that the trust he had extended to Thomas was not misplaced. In the following weeks, preparations began for a ceremony that would honor both traditions. Thomas worked tirelessly on the ranch, repairing and improving structures, creating spaces for community gatherings, and ensuring that the land was ready to welcome family and friends. The young woman contributed her own skills, helping with arrangements, sharing ideas, and ensuring that the customs of her people were respected and celebrated. The collaboration strengthened their bond and allowed them to learn from each other in practical, meaningful ways. Neighbors and members of both the settler community and the Apache tribe observed the preparations with curiosity and respect. The story of the rancher and the chief's daughter had become well known, a tale of unexpected opportunity, courage, and cross-cultural connection. Many came to witness the ceremony, not just to celebrate the union, but also to see the example of trust, understanding, and mutual respect in action. Thomas and the young woman felt the support and recognition of both communities, and this strengthened their resolve to honor their commitment fully. On the day of the ceremony, the ranch was filled with light, laughter, and the quiet hum of anticipation. Friends, neighbors, and family members gathered, representing both the settler community and the Apache tribe. The ceremony blended traditions thoughtfully and respectfully, acknowledging the values, customs, and beliefs of both families. There were speeches, blessings, and symbolic gestures that highlighted unity, trust, and respect. Thomas and the young woman participated fully, demonstrating their understanding, care, and commitment to one another. As the ceremony concluded, Thomas felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The path he had walked, from solitude and uncertainty to connection and commitment, had been challenging, but it had also been transformative. He realized that his life on the ranch, once quiet and predictable, had been enriched beyond measure by this bond. He no longer faced the world alone. He had found a partner who respected him, shared his values, and was willing to grow together. In the weeks and months that followed, life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm. Thomas and the young woman worked side by side, caring for the land, tending animals, and maintaining the household. They shared stories, learned from each other, and built a partnership based on mutual respect and understanding. The young woman introduced new ideas and practices from her culture, and Thomas shared his knowledge of the land and the skills required to thrive as a rancher. Together, they created a life that honored both traditions while building something new and unique. Neighbors and visitors often commented on the harmony and respect that characterized their relationship. Thomas had become a man who was not only respected for his work, but admired for his openness, thoughtfulness, and courage. The young woman's presence brought joy, energy, and a sense of community to the ranch. Together, they had created a life that was richer, fuller, and more meaningful than either could have imagined alone. One evening, as the sun set over the mountains, Thomas and the young woman sat together on the porch, watching the golden light spread across the fields. Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The surprise visit from the chief, the moments of doubt, the conversations, and the growing understanding. He realized that life had offered him an unexpected gift, a chance to form a meaningful connection, to bridge two worlds, and to share his life with someone who truly understood and respected him. The young woman looked at him with a gentle smile. "We have much to learn from each other," she said, "but I believe we can face the future together, with respect and trust." Thomas nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude and hope. He understood that the journey was ongoing, but he was confident that together they could overcome challenges, celebrate joys, and create a life filled with meaning and companionship. Thomas had entered this chapter of his life as a lonely rancher, uncertain and cautious, but through patience, reflection, and open-heartedness, he had found not only love, but also friendship, partnership, and the possibility of shared growth. His story became an example to both communities, that respect, understanding, and courage could bridge differences and create connections that were both profound and lasting. As night fell and stars filled the sky, Thomas felt a quiet peace. The journey that had begun with surprise and hesitation had led to fulfillment and hope. He no longer felt the weight of solitude. Instead, he carried the promise of a future shared with someone who respected, understood, and inspired him. The ranch, once a place of quiet isolation, had become a home filled with life, learning, and love, a testament to the courage to embrace change, to respect differences, and to open one's heart to possibility.